The Denver Broncos have brought back a veteran presence inside the tight end room, and the room now sits at 6 total players. How might the tight end room shape out, and what is the veterans' expected role in the Broncos offense? Plus, we get to know Eyioma Uwazurike, one of the Broncos draft selections, get to know the person and the player on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos country? Good morning. Happy Friday. Welcome back into a brand new episode, Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast here on the Locked on NFL Network, your team every day from the South Stands to the end zone. I'm your host, as always, Cody Rourke. I cover the Denver Broncos on the beat for Mile High Sports, and I'm joined alongside by my co-host, Sarah Bettinger. He covers the Denver Broncos here on the Locked on Broncos podcast, not to mention predominantlyorange.com. Broncos country, once again, thank you so much for making Locked on Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. Both Sarah Bettinger and myself, we appreciate you, whether you listen on your favorite audio podcasting platform, free and available everywhere, or here on YouTube. Make sure you do us a favor. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications so you never miss out on a day's worth of Denver Broncos news, content, coverage, and analysis, and more. Sarah, my friend, hey, the Broncos, they've brought back a veteran tight end in Eric Saubert, a move that I am personally jacked up about. I can't wait to talk about it with Broncos country and you. And I can't wait to get to know Eyioma Uwazurike as both a person and a player on today's brand new episode of the show, my friend.
I love it, Cody. I love it. Absolutely. Eric Saubert coming back to the Denver Broncos on a one-year deal. You love to see that, especially just for a guy getting rewarded, right, for doing a good job last season. Eric Saubert was consistently available. He played special teams, and now you've got a new coaching staff coming in, and they brought him back, which I think speaks to the fact that his 2021 film was quite good, and I love that the Broncos added him to the tight end room. I wrote a piece on Predominantly Orange right after the NFL draft, looking at the potential of signing. Remember Kyle Rudolph worked out for the team a few weeks back, so I liked the idea of bringing in another tight end, somebody to really fortify that room who can do a little bit of everything, and I think Eric Saubert accomplishes that.
Well, I think he adds what the Broncos are looking for as well, right? A guy who's going to be a core four. That's one of my favorite terms. A core four special teams player here for Dwayne Stukes. Part of me has a reason, and this move happened because of the fact that he was a key standout on special teams last year for the Broncos, and that's where he kind of got ingrained there. But also, you mentioned his underrated role in the offensive side of the ball. He wasn't nearly utilized as much in the passing game, Sarah, as I felt like he should have been last year. Like, we saw him in the preseason making some big-time catches, runs after the catch for the Broncos. And then we were wondering, how come we didn't see much of that in the regular season? We didn't see him utilize much there. He could be an under the radar chain mover here for this Broncos offense. But, who could be the odd man out right now in this Broncos tight end room? Because right now, Denver is carrying 6 on the roster, which, as we understand, going into training camp, you want to hold a multitude of guys. And I think guys like Saubert will get veterans days off. But you mentioned a one-year deal. The Broncos tight end room right now, Albert O, Greg Dulcich, obviously the Broncos addition in the NFL draft here. Andrew Beck, who they had just re-signed in the offseason on a one-year deal. Eric Tomlinson, who they brought in free agency. Sean Byer, and now Eric Saubert. So it's like not every single one of these guys will be on the roster. You'll probably have 3 on the active roster here in 2022 and 1 guy on the practice squad. I'm having a very hard time thinking who's going to be the odd man out. Like, my first inclination is to say Sean Byer because he was a practice squad guy for them. But, like, could Eric Tomlinson, even though he's a free agency signing, could he be an odd man out? Could Andrew Beck, who re-signed, be the odd man out? I'm very perplexed as to how the Broncos are going to make this work in that tight end room. Like I said, I'm glad that Saubert is back. I think he deserves a place on this roster. But then it's like, who is going to be out in your opinion?
Right. That's the big question right now. And just as we look forward, look ahead, I mean, I think obviously Albert O and then Greg Dulcich, the rookie, they're going to be locks for the roster. So I think for me, Cody, I got to look back at the Green Bay Packers from just last season to kind of see, all right, early September, what did the Packers roster look like, and how much, did Nathaniel Hackett really have to do with that in terms of picking who made the roster? The Green Bay Packers started off last year, Cody, with 4 tight ends, and one of them, Josiah DeGuara, he was on the PUP, the physically unable to perform list. So they really only started with 3 guys at the tight end position. So that makes you wonder if there's 6 guys right now on the Denver Broncos 90-man roster, and you've got 5 of them that you really think, I mean, with all due respect to Sean Byer, who I think is going to be an intriguing player to watch this offseason, I think 5 of these guys are legitimate candidates right now, or at least 5 guys that you say, okay, Alberto and Greg Dulcich, they're locks. So then there's 3 other guys that have NFL experience behind them, and they all kind of play vastly different roles, don't they? I mean, Eric Saubert, he's known for special teams. Andrew Beck, kind of known more for his fullback, H-back / tight end / special teams ability. And then obviously Eric Tomlinson, who's really an extension of your offensive line. That leads me to believe, Cody, that they're going to try to keep 4 tight ends on this roster, with potentially Beck as the 4th guy, being that, hybrid fullback tight end who can kind of play in the backfield, do a little bit of everything there for you. But maybe Saubert does that for you. I don't know. I think this is a really tough question to answer right now, because you've added a number of guys that are kind of in that same space, or that same tier, where it's like, they're not like necessarily, that guy's a lock for the roster, like you paid him X amount of dollars, but they're also not in that space that's like, like last year, Saubert, he was kind of felt like a camp body, right?
Yeah.
Well, this year it feels way different because they're re-signing him. So I think that's where the big question marks come in for me, and I think that's going to be fun to watch it all play out, because that's where competition comes into play. And I think that this move really creates some additional competition to say, hey, I mean, we've got 3 guys that we legitimately think could be on the roster. We want to keep at least 2 of them, but let's see how the cream rises to the top over the course of the next 3 months.
A bigger question I have, do the Broncos really plan on having a fullback, right? I think with Andrew Beck, is there a fullback role in this offense, with Russell Wilson under center, a fullback, a running back behind him out of I formation or an offset I formation? If that's the case, and if Andrew Beck is that guy, I think what you alluded to earlier, I think you could also make Eric Saubert a backup at that position there to Andrew Beck, but you can also use him as a key backup on the offensive side of the ball at tight end. So I think it kind of makes it, okay, hey, they may carry 5 guys who can play tight end in a sense, but one of those guys will have a role as one of those fullback options too. That could be something the Broncos look at doing. And I'll be sure once I get to training camp, I'll be sure to ask that question on how they plan to utilize all these guys in that room, Sarah. But, obviously I'm a big fan of Eric Saubert returning. I thought throughout the offseason, for me, when we did our would you swipe left, swipe right on bringing them back, we both swiped right on Eric Saubert because of the value that he did add as a blocker and as a guy who was really underutilized in the passing game. I think in this offense, how we've seen Nathaniel Hackett and the Packers in the past use tight ends, I think that Denver could find a way for Saubert to make some plays alongside Dulcich and Alberto. It's great security blanket, great insurance to have here for this Broncos team. But Broncos country, coming up here in just a moment, we're going to get into one of the Broncos draft selections at 116th overall in Eyioma Uwazurike. We get to know the person, we get to know the player coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, let me tell you about the sponsor of today's episode, Locked On Broncos. There's good friends over there at Blue Nile. And with Mother's Day coming up, BlueNile.com has jewelry experts on hand 24/7, available via phone or chat to help you find a memorable gift at every budget. And you get to celebrate the special women in your life. On BlueNile.com, you can easily navigate through thousands of fine jewelry options at every price point. And this Mother's Day, give mom something that she'll treasure forever with fine jewelry from BlueNile.com. And Locked On Sports listeners can get $50 off of $500. And this podcast exclusive is only good through Mother's Day. Use promo code Locked On. Once again, promo code Locked On. Plus, every order is insured, it ships free, and arrives in discreet packaging that won't give away what's inside. So you can shop stress-free and find your forever piece. Go to BlueNile.com here today. And our good friends over there, BetOnline.net. And BetOnline is your number one source for all your sports betting stats and information this season. You can find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including this year's basketball playoffs, Major League Baseball, and this weekend's run to the Roses as the Kentucky Derby returns. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering information, from live betting to playoffs to esports and more. Head to the website or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, Sarah, as we jump into the second half action on today's episode, Lockdown Broncos. Once again, mile-high salute to everybody in Broncos country. Thank you so much for making Lockdown Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. Both Sarah Bettinger and myself, we appreciate every single one of you in Broncos country, your interaction that we get so much. Keep it up and help us keep growing the show. We appreciate it as always. Now we continue our get to know series here, which has been, we've gotten great feedback from Broncos fans that they're loving to learn a little bit more about these players that the Broncos drafted as human beings, what they're interested in, a little bit of their background. And I think it's a very cool thing that we're doing here, Sarah. So, like I said, it's a great idea to humanize these pro athletes, which sometimes in this sport doesn't happen enough. There's a lot of dehumanization in pro sports, and we hope to change that with what we do here. Getting to know Eyioma Uwazurike, the Broncos' 116th overall pick in the 2022 NFL draft. And like Damari Mathis, he has a background, he has a degree in communication. So I imagine he's going to be a very fun person to work with from the PR side when the Broncos get him set up for some interviews. Now, interesting enough, going back to him as a dominant high school football player in the state of Michigan, he had offers from Michigan State, Temple, and UCF, and he ultimately chose to go with Iowa State, which obviously in this year's NFL draft, they've produced a lot of NFL players and quality players at that. I know you're an Iowa fan, so anytime there's an Iowa State mention, it's like, all right, hey, there's that Civil War rivalry that you always talk about. But, you being an Iowa Hawkeyes guy, what else can you possibly tell us here about Eyioma Uwazurike as he grew up through the ranks of high school, going through college, and more?
Well, I think it's really important to note what you just talked about, the fact that he was a big-time high school athlete in the state of Michigan, and the fact that Matt Campbell at Iowa State was able to pull him out of the state of Michigan with an offer from Michigan State. So that just speaks volumes to what, Matt Campbell, obviously a lot of NFL teams, or a lot of rumors surrounding NFL head coaching vacancies. They've gravitated towards Matt Campbell because of the great work that he's done with that Iowa State Cyclones program. And for Eyioma Uwazurike to be a team captain on Matt Campbell's team, that to me means a lot. I mean, it's a really big deal for a guy like that who leads with such charisma as a head coach. To have a player like Uwazurike be a team captain for you, I think is really big, Cody. So I think it's a great note. They pull him out of the state of Michigan, and you get him into a unit now in Denver where you're playing at the college level at Iowa State and kind of on an ascending program, right? Iowa State got up into the top 10 this past season, at least early in the season. Their talent level was ridiculous. Like you mentioned, a number of guys drafted in the 2022 NFL draft, but Uwazurike was somebody that I think they relied on to do a lot of different things. And it's fascinating to me, Cody, the Broncos have now brought in a couple of potential starters, whether it be this year or next year, on the defensive side of the ball through this draft class, meaning specifically Nick Bonito and then here Eyioma Uwazurike, that primarily played in a 3-3-5 defense collegiately, which is very interesting. I mean, we talk about what is Ejiro Evero's scheme going to look like. We know that he wants to send extra pressure. We know that he wants to use a lot of nickel and dime. So what did he do in the NFL draft? At least what did the Denver Broncos do? They go out and they get a lot of guys that have a lot of experience playing in three-man fronts, especially Uwazurike, who played all over that D-line for the Cyclones.
Well, he was a first-team all Big 12 selection by coaches there, which I think speaks volumes for him. Now, one thing, as we saw at Iowa State coming in from just his freshman season, redshirt freshman season, what he had done every single year, Sarah, he showed drastic improvement. Now, his first year playing in the college level, he was a role player. He wasn't necessarily a starter. The next season, he became a full-time starter, and he became one of their best players on the defensive side of the ball for the Cyclones. And then each year, just steady progression, which I think that for him, when you see that constant improvement from year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4 at the collegiate level, I think that is a translatable formula here for the National Football League. And I think that's what the Broncos coaching staff and the scouts saw from him. This is a guy that will improve year to year. He's shown consistency. He's shown growth, which I think that is super important. Sometimes you run into college prospects that maybe have like 2 really good years at the collegiate level, but it's like boom or bust, right? Can they continue to grow at the NFL level? And I think that Uwazurike has all the traits, or not to mention, he can play any of the techniques. He can play outside if you need him to. He can play the 5 tech. He can play a 4-eye. He can play a 3 tech, a 2-eye. He can play a 1 technique or a 0 if you really wanted to. The Broncos' versatility to be able to use him anywhere is there, and he said he's open to playing anywhere that the coaches need him, and I really envision a strong fit for him on this Broncos defense. There is that, but now outside of that too, you mentioned there, he's played some really good competition, and he's played against a couple of first-round offensive tackles here as well, sir. So let's touch on that. Who is a key guy that when we watched him on the tape, how did he stand out against maybe a first-round draft pick in the NFL draft at offensive tackle from the 2022 class?
Yeah, I watched him go up against Northern Iowa's Trevor Penning, Cody, and like I said, and like you just said, he played a variety of positions for Iowa State. So it wasn't like he was matched up on Trevor Penning the entire game, but it was a great battle between these two guys. If you get an opportunity, again, we'll reiterate, YouTube is a fantastic resource to watch these guys play. You may not get all 22 or coaches film for every single one of these prospects, but you're going to get a matchup between Trevor Penning and Eyioma Uwazurike there for your viewing pleasure and for just evaluating him as a potential fit for the Denver Broncos. So what I saw, Cody, a lot of times when you have a defensive lineman that's over 6'6" and an 85-inch wingspan, you have a lot of issues with guys that don't play with great leverage. But when you see him go up against Trevor Penning, you do see him play with some really good leverage. And there's a number of plays on that game tape where Uwazurike just drives Trevor Penning back into the quarterback's breadbasket. So that was really good to see. And then I watched him go up against Tyler Linderbaum, the first-round center for the Baltimore Ravens, against Iowa. And this was a really good battle between these two guys. And I think this is an area where I saw Uwazurike have some room for growth as well. We talked about playing with leverage. Obviously, Tyler Linderbaum being a bit smaller than Trevor Penning at the tackle position there. Tyler Linderbaum was able to get some leverage against Uwazurike, who lined up pretty consistently in that Iowa game. He lined up as the 0 or right over the center. And they just kind of put best on best there. Iowa State's best defensive lineman against Iowa's best offensive lineman. And a lot of times Linderbaum got the better of him. But I think that's a learning experience and an opportunity for growth to say, okay, I can play the 0, I can play over the center, but I have to play with better leverage. I have to utilize my raw power. I have to utilize my length a little bit better. I maybe have to time the snap a little bit better. But I think those are two battles that you can find readily available on YouTube to watch just every snap these guys play against each other, and two great matchups to show why I think a lot of people believe Uwazurike could be a starter for the Denver Broncos in the near future.
Well, can Uwazurike start for the Broncos immediately here in 2022 as a rookie? That's something Sarah Bettinger and myself will talk about coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, let me tell you about Built Bar, the other sponsor of today's episode, Lockdown Broncos. And Built Bar is the best tasting protein bar that is out there on the market today. They have 9 amazing original flavors, plus the occasional limited time flavor like the Built Puffs and the brand new Built granola bars. Check it out, the 3 amazing flavors at built.com here today. And Built Bar is great for you if you need a little bit of an extra push throughout your day, because each bar is jam-packed with 17 grams of protein, 130 calories, and only 4 grams of sugar. And I want you and your family to get your hands on a box of Built Bar here today for your taste buds by going to built.com. And when you go to checkout, make sure you use promo code LOCKED15. That's one word, LOCKED15, to get 15% off your next order today at built.com. As we jump into the fourth quarter action on today's episode, Lockdown Broncos. Once again, Broncos country, thank you so much for making Lockdown Broncos your first listen of the day. We appreciate you so much, and we'll have daily content for you all year long for all things that you need here on the Lockdown Broncos podcast. Sarah, as we project Eyioma Uwazurike's fit here in 2022, I think there's a lot of questions that need to be answered, and I think maybe we can provide a little bit of clarity here. The first question is Uwazurike the Broncos' successor in 2022 for Shelby Harris at the defensive end position? I think when you look at the Broncos defensive line room, the defensive end room, guys who can play that position right now, you look at it, you have Deshaun Williams, who you brought back, Draymond Jones, who's obviously the locked-in starter on the opposite side of whoever's going to get the start here, Marquise Spencer, who was a 7th-round pick by the Broncos, and George Payton in 2020. And then you go through and you have McTelvin Agim, who was part of the Vic Fangio defense that really, didn't get utilized enough by Vic Fangio and the staff last season. Jonathan Kongbo, who's more than likely going to be a camp body, and then also a defensive lineman, and Matt Henningsen, who was drafted this year by the Broncos as well out of Wisconsin. There's a lot of movement here on this defensive line here. Could Uwazurike start in place of Shelby Harris this upcoming season?
Well, there's a lot of players that you just mentioned right there, Cody, and there's a lot of question marks, which I think a lot of times gets perceived as a bad thing. But I think in the case of the 2022 Denver Broncos, it makes things very interesting, right? You have so many young bodies, like you mentioned, Marquise Spencer. How will he do in his second year? McTelvin Agim had this great offseason, great training camp, really good stuff in the preseason, and then all of a sudden he didn't play in the regular season, which was mind-boggling to all of us. So is he the guy that steps in for Shelby Harris Deshaun Williams, you bring him back for depth. I like the defensive line right now, just in terms of you got a lot of young players on that D line with a lot of explosive traits. And I think, yes, there's question marks because barely any of these guys have proven anything at the NFL level. But I think there's a lot of intrigue there for me, Cody. And I really do think Uwazurike could be a starter for the Denver Broncos. I think if he had been taken at pick number 96 overall, I don't think anybody would have batted an eye. I think a lot of people would have been like, hey, that was a good pick. I had him as a late day 2 guy, late 3rd round player. And so I think that there's an opportunity there for that because the Broncos took a couple guys in the late 3rd round last year in a pretty similar pick range to where they got Damari Mathis and Eyioma Uwazurike with Quinn Miners and Baron Browning, who hey, we expected them to be eventual starters. So I think you have to go with the same kind of treatment for a guy like Uwazurike, that maybe he doesn't start day 1 in place of Shelby Harris, but I think definitely at some point, and I think that the big factor for me in this, Cody, and I wrote this down in our show notes, is it ideal for him to start off in a rotation because you're hoping for progression from McTelvin Agim. I know he wasn't a George Payton draft pick, but at the same time, he was a 3rd round player and somebody that I think showed the potential last season. So how much does that factor in? And is it ideal for Uwazurike to be the starter because that means that guys like Agim or guys like Marquise Spencer didn't necessarily progress this season?
I think that's a good point that you make, especially with Agim. The great preseason, the great training camp that he had last year, and like even in the regular season and the games he did get in, he did have an impact. He was an impact pass rush creator here for the Broncos defense on that defensive interior for them. And I do think, okay, hey, I think it would be okay. And ideally, like for me, unless Uwazurike is coming in and just absolutely manhandling and destroying guys and looks like the best guy out there, I wouldn't be opposed to Agim potentially being that placeholder to start opposite of Draymond Jones and next to either Mike Purcell or DJ Jones, depending on what package the Broncos are in defensively. And then rotating a guy like Uwazurike in initially here because, you still have to cut your teeth. You're a rookie. You're going to have to pay your dues a little bit. But I think if it's too hard to ignore his presence, I think one thing that's going to stand out with Marcus Dixon as the defensive line coach and Coach Bill Collar, who's around, I think that if he stands out, and obviously if there's any chance if he does start, I think that he's earned it. I think that it'll probably be coming off the precipice of that because those guys will recognize that talent here for the Broncos. And hey, look, they have a lot of options right now, as we mentioned on that defensive line. At Broncos country, we want to ask you, who do you think will get the start at the defensive end position opposite of Draymond Jones here in 2022? Is it Eyioma Uwazurike? Let us know in the comment section down below or tweet us on Twitter at Cody Rourke NFL, at Sarah Bettinger, at Locked On Broncos. But with that said, folks, thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Some things to look forward to next week. The NFL schedule release will become official. Sarah and I will break it down when it happens. We can't wait to figure out who the Broncos are playing and when, and talk about some of the key storylines with all of you here on the Locked On Broncos podcast. You get that next week here on the show. With that said, enjoy your weekend. Sarah Bettinger and I will have some other content coming for you here on the YouTube channel. Keep your eyes peeled for that as well. But in the meantime, Broncos country, let's ride.